Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we're bringing you a special day 449 with Alexey Arestovych, former advisor to the Office of the President of Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel, and Yulia Latynina, Russian investigative journalist. As always, our sincere thanks go to our members who support our channel. Today, kudos go to Willis, Igor, Yelena Einhorn, Daniel Smith, Dave Hopper, and Zenny Gaming, and of course to our super thanks star, Bill S. Thank you. Without further ado, here is Alexey and Julia. Enjoy. Good day, this is Yulia Latynina, as always on Thursdays with Alexey. It is 5 p.m. in Moscow and in Kiev, and I'm not sure where is Alexey, but hello. Guys, do not forget to subscribe to Alexey's channel if you have not done that yet. If there are ones who did not click that button, do not forget to subscribe to our modest Latynina TV and click the like button and share that stream. And of course, if you are listening or watching that in English, do not forget to do that same for Privateer Station. Okay, Alexey, so obviously I know what to start with about the missile strike on Kyiv, and it seems like Putin believed his own generals' fairy tales that they destroyed a Patriot system, because I can't explain anything with anything else the fact that they attacked with the old Axis Kyiv, basically the next day after the previous attempt. However, maybe you have a different theory. Yeah, Yulia, I have a different one. There's a good old anecdote when there is a traffic police cop is resting after the night shift at a place that he routinely stops cars, gets the bribes, and all of a sudden he sees people from road service who come there and start painting the third line in between two sides of the road. And he comes over and like, hey guys, why are you doing that? Like, that won't help, right? You realize the other two don't. Well, yeah, it won't, but we got to do something, right? So, yeah, that's the message. So it won't help anything, including counteroffensive, just for them to slow it down or something. It won't help anything. They have different goals. They want to terrorize our population. They still want to provide pressure on our people to perhaps pressure our leadership to sit down and negotiate, and also perhaps pressure Ukraine into accepting the conditions of China, proposed by China. So I want to bring here another question. After these missile strikes, Mr. Hui, that Chinese ex-ambassador to Moscow, was suggesting to stop the war immediately, and I promised that Russia will not conduct their offensive further. And he was basically sent to go into some dark place where the sun doesn't shine. Well, I'm not sure, Yulia, if he was sent in these terms, but official message was that Ukraine cannot accept any option, any version where Russia gets any piece of Ukraine's land. And this was stated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmitry Kuleba, and as we know, there are only three people who can speak on behalf of the country: President, Prime Minister, and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also the head of Congress, so four. And one of these four people gave him a clear message that Chinese plan needs some correction. What about Pope? Well, in my opinion, our president reacted rather sternly to Pope's initiative. I was thinking he might use softer terminology, and he used the word unacceptable, which in diplomatic parlance means the highest degree of not acceptance and rejection. So this, in the protocol, that is a very strong statement. So that also didn't work. So, Alex, I heard that Putin right now does want to sign peace treaty, but I suspect he has lost all contact with reality, because the terms that I was told that his conditions are that he gets everything that he already occupied, and he also gets Donbas and Lugansk regions in the full borders of those administrative districts. And my whole instrumentation of philologist and literary experts, I just don't have words for that. I can say how it can be named. I have a rather colorful life and I see different people. So once I was in a company of a very interesting person who spent about 45 years in gulags in Kalama. And he used the phrase as bold as the Kalima FAGs. And when I clarified why that vivid comparison, he said, well, they really have nothing to lose there. So Prigozhin and Putin, in their statements, are very much reminiscent of that colorful comparison, I think. So I would bring that from a different side, that with Kinjals or those missiles, maybe it made sense. So they sent one, which first probably even recorded something and got the targeting a little better of the Patriot systems. For the second volley, then they sent 6 others, and they almost got Patriot. Even one of the Patriot systems, actually, what we heard, the pieces of Kinjal fell on the equipment, so it was shot down really close to it. But and I was thinking that maybe Ukraine is luring Putin, saying that, look, we cannot defend ourselves anymore. We barely handle what you have. And perhaps lured him to do that big strike next day. And the next day, he just launches a big volley of the old missiles, perhaps thinking that there are no Patriots and no systems to intercept it. No, Julia, I think what they did could be called the change of tactics on a smart level language, but practically they just were looking for other options to try to confuse our air defense systems and probably cause some damage right before the visit of that Chinese diplomat. They used a very combined assortment of missiles in a short time frame, when we had about 40 missiles over 5 or 10 minutes. So they were hopeful to oversaturate and perhaps get through our defense systems, and they failed in their planning. We took it all out, and also tonight there was another barrage, and we shot them all down again. So what can we say? The agenda is not only Kiev. There are other cities that we have that are not as well covered as Kiev. And today some of our spokesperson actually had to explain why Kiev is better protected than other cities. And the typical answer is that Kiev is being attacked more than any other target. And also Kiev is stronger or more rich in targets than any other location in the country. So that is all fine and true. Besides one side note, that all these measures have no achievable result. Even if we imagine something unthinkable, that we fail to shoot even a single missile. So all that hit Kiev. And overnight we got, let's say, 30 apartment-style multi-story buildings destroyed in Kiev, like the one they destroyed in Dnieper. What next? Would we be more negotiable at the table? I would pose that we probably would be more aggressive. We would be more looking for revenge, and our soldiers will be fighting stronger on the front. Our people would be helping them with more vigor, and president would have taken an immovable position where from even the God wouldn't be able to move him. So, not even talking about Pope. So that action doesn't have any rational target, any rational goal. And Putin continues to act in his own logic that is not really well correlating with reality. Well, the whole war, Alexei, is not rational, right? Agree. If we take his Chinese counterparts, for example, when they attacked Vietnam in 1979, and it was so-called the first socialist war, they basically had enough over a month and a half to figure out that things don't pan out according to their plans. And they stopped the war, announced themselves winners, and then started a lot of reforms inside China, which led them to the position that they occupy currently. Putin is lacking in his mental capacity, and oh God, I'm leaning to the barracks language, and I'll need to filter myself a little bit. I'm sorry, Alexei, for making expressing surprise with your previous statement. We probably got a little rougher during this war, and I think this vivid language is very applicable to this current war. Well, okay, so I think he is torturing a goat, basically, and it is Russian Federation or system that he created in Russia that is that goat. And for the world, it looks like completely idiotic structure, and internally it is rich in terror against its own people. Today, for example, their news was or flying with the data that FSB got rights to enter your home and seize any evidence without any warrant. So it's just escalating there. In Ekaterinburg, Roisman is also being taken to court, known opposition leader, and Krieger, another person that was recently that made the news. So they keep clearing up the opposition sphere. So logic that he has is the only logic is to hold on to power, but to waste your precious kinjals over that's a little high of a price. How many kinjals do you think they have? I'm thinking maybe 40. Okay, my sources are saying it was about 100 overall, perhaps. But again, even if they have 100, they have other issues related to kinjal. It's not only that this is the one myth before the last one they have. Their last myth would be a tactical nuclear weapon that they supposedly have, because in the new doctrine that they had, the carrier for that tactical nuke was kinjal. And if it's not achieving targets, if it can be shot down with Patriot system, then how are you going to use your tactical nuke? And one needs also to understand that the United States can bring probably hundreds of air defense Patriot systems to counter 100 Russian kinjals. It may take some time, but in this race between Russia and the United States, it probably will be the same picture as years, times and times again. In the First World War, Second World War, everybody who tried to compete with the military-industrial complex of the United States, they failed. And now the leaders of that competition can be represented. One, I think they have a hat somewhere in a museum. Another place, they have a piece of jaw. So, yeah, there probably will be some remnants of Putin somewhere at the end. And locally, yeah, that could be explained as clinging onto power, but overall, in a strategic field, this is an outstanding example of idiotism. He's wasting strategic stash of weapons that gives Russia at least some advantage. And he's wasting it at the conflict where he cannot achieve victory, where he lost strategically, where Russian army can't even do operative offensives, only tactical pushes here and there. And it reminds me of, in a very down-to-earth example, when people set the house on fire to warm themselves up. Yeah, they will get warm for 15 minutes and then minus 30 outside and they'll freeze over. But these 15 minutes will be pretty bright. Just, they won't achieve anything, even if they would be at least able to penetrate our air defense systems, but they can't do even that. Alexey, there must be some exception to that burning house statement, because some drivers, truck and 18-wheeler drivers up north in Norilsk and somewhere Murmansk and further up north, they were saying that if your truck broke down and the engine doesn't work and you're freezing over, that's your last-ditch effort to set the truck on fire, because that will provide you a signal and also perhaps another 15 minutes to half an hour of life, and in hopes that somebody will come and maybe rescue. Well, okay, so going over the lack of strategic reasoning behind Putin's actions, there may not be any strategic ideation, but there is a lot of will and eagerness to use it. And we see that last time one of these kinjals almost got to the Patriot, it was shot down right above it. And if Putin had at least 7 jets who can carry these kinjals, then it might have been harder for Ukrainian air defense forces to defend themselves. because as I understood, that missile was aimed directly at the Patriot system. And probably the first the first target for Ukraine to get as many Patriots as they can, as urgently as they can. And as I understood, President Zelensky turned almost overnight to President of Poland to basically rent or use the Patriots that Poland was given. Because it's a big difference if Kinjal was shot down so unsuccessfully for Russia as this one, or if it actually hit one of the Patriot systems. Well, I don't have that exact information about how they are getting new Patriots, but I got fresh data that overnight we destroyed 2 more Kinjals, and that came from our air defense systems. And, little by little, these 100 Kinjals may evaporate completely. And also, Russia is lacking good pilots to shoot them from their jets, because that takes special training. All right, then let's talk about other important military topics, because my impression is that what we're seeing is basically a phase 0 of counteroffensive. Not the counteroffensive itself, but the chain of inevitable steps that will lead to that. As Viktor Suvorov wrote in his books, in some cases, mobilization is already war. And I would like you to compare the special features of that phase 0. Elon Musk's launchpad, he calls it stage 0 because it plays a very important part in launching his vehicles. So let's compare our stage 0 we see in Ukraine with what we've seen in Soviet times, for example, in 1940s, and also with how last big offensives unfolded. For example, in Iraq in 2000, the role of drones, the role of information, the role of different hybrid operations on the front. What would you highlight? Well, here we are venturing into my favorite area, the history of operative arts. And the main message here would be that the best operations need to fit 3 major factors. The first one, they need to be applicable to the quality, dislocation, and territory occupied by the enemy. Second, they need to match quality, territory, and readiness of your own troops. And each time, a smart army would be using different operational tactics following these postulates. And right now, on the military theater, there is only one army. There is only Ukrainian army that is using or following these rules. Because if you look at our behavior in Kherson, up in the north or near Bahmut, we behave and we fight very different wars. For example, in Kherson area and Kharkov were drastically different from each other because the location and the forested areas are very different. How was it? Can you elaborate more? Kherson was a slow grinding of their defense because of the minefields and tank barriers, irrigation channels, and also very open steppe where you cannot hide. Any aggregation of troops, you get hit by a missile. And we did suffer quite a bit of losses there. And Kharkov operation, which allows, due to forested areas, to turn around, to flank the enemy, to surprise them. And the temp there was really high. In 3 days, we went as far as 100 kilometers. Zhukov in the Second World War times was giving awards for the motorcycle and mounted horsemen for just being able to push into the enemy-occupied territory for 100 kilometers a day. You didn't even have to fire a gun, just as long as you provide that pressure. So what is happening now, that's phase 0, as you're saying, in Western military arts, it has a name. It's called formation of the battlefield. And in this case, battlefield is being used as the chessboard, where it is being positioned in the right light, in the right angle, where you need to also remove a few important figures before you do your offensive. So you take out certain pieces of that chessboard that would cause you trouble. And that basically is a preparation phase that will afford our infantry and tanks to move easier. when the time comes. So this is happening, and it is going in several directions, which also precludes enemy from where guessing right where the main force will be applied. And each tactical officer would want to keep that element of surprise. That's what we're trying to do here. Frankly, all of the military arts, regardless of where you studied, in Philippines, in Israel, in Odessa, or in Moscow, you essentially would be studying the same material. It's just like the laws of nature. It just makes difference how are you applying that. The more unique and thought out the application is, the better usually the results. Non-standard tactics applied right usually bring tremendous results in the war theater because everybody knows the usual moves, right? Just like Russia keeps doing. Let's just draw a straight line from point A to point B and break it with our forwards and break all defenses there. I actually talked to one of the higher officers that were defending in the early days of war near Izum, and they did not have much experience fighting Russian army, their group at that location. But he said, when I saw Russian troops going down the same road, which already was peppered with dead bodies and broken pieces of their equipment from previous 11 attacks, they still used the same road, even though there were ways around it. And we didn't have much of the protection on our flanks, because all they needed really is to change the direction of attack to get us out, to kick us out of our positions. And that's when that myth about Russian army and the strength of it dispelled in my mind. I couldn't believe that their professionals would be wasting themselves with such a dumb effort and concentrated effort in the same spot. That reminds me of another joke, Alexey, about the army of goats led by a lion, or an army of lions led by a goat. Yeah, well, perhaps. But in 10 days, over the resistance that I was talking to that guy when they were defending that position, Russian side did not make a single attempt to deviate from the way they behaved. The road was already destroyed, damaged. It was just difficult to move through, but they kept using the same approach. And that lit the bulb in my mind, because my second wife is from a very small town in Zhytomyr region, and one time I was walking that town and I saw the stela to Soviet soldiers who died in the Second World War taking that little town. 6.5 thousand names perished. The town is maybe a few thousand people right now, and during the Second World War it probably was smaller than that. How could you waste a rifle division, 6.5 thousand people? I could not even imagine. Theoretically, I could probably imagine that, but there was a disconnect between, the emotional and mental connection there. And now, with looking at what's happening on the front, I am acquiring that experience. On the evening of the 25th of February, right after the war started, I actually made a postulate for myself to try to prognosticate. In effort to prognosticate how Russian troops will behave, I should pick the 2 points. On the left side of the scale would be the smartest one, on the right would be the dumbest one. And I should be leaning in my actions toward the right one, to the dumbest actions. But in just about 2 days, Russian command completely destroyed my expectations. How do you mean? Well, I was completely destroyed in my expectations, because every time when I imagined the furthermost point on the dumb side of that scale, they were able to invent something even dumber 4 steps even further. So I couldn't even, how should I say that? I didn't expect that they will be fighting like Napoleons on A+ marks, grades. They haven't had good commanders for a while, but to that degree, idiotic to that level, and it's related to everything, kinzhals and actions of the troops on the ground. So every time I'm out of wits, I cannot imagine the dumb move that they will make. Ukrainian army is a little different. In 2014, it was rather destroyed shambles of its former self, and in 2014, on the blood of their own soldiers, it started to build its own national school of military art. That's what started to be formed. If you remember how sad and puny were our mistakes and motions at the beginning of this conflict, we were basically a group of boys for beating. Not even Ilovaisk, but for example, our paratroopers, the 25th Brigade, that had to surrender. All the motions around Slavyansk when the tanks came and destroyed the block post. When we let Girkin and his column out, very sad actions that I actually was part of. I was there. And that in those days, I was actually shooting from a vantage point. Babai, the guy with his 40 guys who came to Kramatorsk to take it, he was one of their field leaders, right? Yeah, one of the field commanders. He was a friend of Girkin with a big hat and big beard. So Girkin sent him to capture Kramatorsk, and I was working there at that time. And there is a video recording where I shoot their approach to the city and how they drive through the main streets. And I'm going to the airport of that town. We have about 500 cream de la cream of our special services, different kinds, and 13 generals with them. Alexey, that's scary. 13 generals is scary. It's 12 too many, right? So I'm coming to them. I'm telling, hey, let's go finish off those 40 invaders because they're not proper military. They have pretty much rifle, just shotguns, and poorly armed, poorly dressed. And there is no way for them to make an ambush. I'll lead you guys. I'll show you where they are. And they're also locals who are eager to help us. And let's close this question. And they failed to make a decision. And Kramatorsk was occupied by this small group initially, and it was occupied for a month and a half. Some people were tortured and executed, and only a month and a half later, those guys withdrew. So that's a little bit about decisions of Ukrainian army back in the day. I also remember our armor columns that took about an hour and a half to start all the engines for infantry armored vehicles, which had no working accumulator, so they had to use one to start every single one, and the others were waiting till everybody's working. Then our helicopters that were falling out of the sky, which first were not getting enough missiles, then they didn't know how to use it. Even I have a video somewhere where they shot 2 helis in one day, and that was after that event when I started working on the radio transmission, radio relay systems for our military, so that we could communicate. Because National Guard saw where the helicopters crashed, but they couldn't reach military back in those days because of the very poor communication between different forces. And it was a collection of a lot of poor decisions, a lot of grief, and at the same time of despair, and very strong decisions eventually starting to grow out of that. And these 9 years actually played a very good role, a positive role in formation of our army, of our military forces. And I don't know if we talked about that, but forces of so-called Donetsk and Lugansk regions, republics, they were fighting probably better than Russian professional military. So I would highlight only Wagner and these two groups. But they were good only initially when they had the first group of people who were fighting with us for those 8 years. So yeah, not the newcomers, right? The professional ones who were there for those 8 years. Yeah, exactly. Those are the ones who were on the border, on that occupied region, and they were fighting with us for the 8 years. And they had more experience than that scary army that were supposed to be so afraid. But they're idiots. So that big army is idiots, is idiotic. It's a very pathetic scope of decisions they're making. As Mark Twain said, let's put the curtain of pity over that scene. So Putin basically succeeded in training Ukrainian army, but failed to train his own. That's precious, right? And that's what usually happens. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alexey, but usually countries that are fighting, they usually evolve. They usually catch up in tactics and the level of fighting. Right, and there is a chance for them to evolve as well, but it'll take them some time. They even failed to create a proper mobilization system right now. When they needed to mobilize somebody, they failed to create anything. And we actually succeeded. So we had a chance to mobilize to counter their invasion this time. All right. So if we talk about actual events happening on the front, those called, for example, drones that were not did not have a chapter in military books, right? When you were studying, the drones were a new kind of arms, and even 2003, drones were not really widely used. And the only war where they were used before is probably Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict, but the scale of that conflict is smaller. So, what could you say about that kind of equipment? I think it's an interesting point, Yulia, but overall, this war confirmed all the classic points of waging the warfare. And all these lovers of high tech and new net centric war efforts and all, their expectations failed. And it seems like nothing really changed, and drone is just another tool in the asset of infantry. And the main core of each conflict is the conflict of people, regardless of how they're armed. And your main advantage is having motivated infantry that's capable of storming or defending their positions from the enemy storming them. So, for example, today Azov reported that on the western outskirts of Bahmut, they kicked out some of the Wagner troops. They moved in for about 700 meters and deep and 2 kilometers wide. So they kicked them out. Russian Wagner's out. They're taking prisoners. They had reported at least a couple hundred killed soldiers of the enemy. And these are the only troops that I know that actually joke and laugh at the body cam videos as they fight. So this is the motivated infantry. This is the infantry that is capable of solving tasks that are by the book probably unsolvable. They manage to push the enemy away when the enemy is exceeding them in the sheer troop number. They still manage to succeed, to pressure them out, and these are the detachments we have. And Russian army, for its whole might, has only Wagner that can solve some tasks, and even those at the cost of tremendous meat losses. Our troops are fighting with skill, their troops are fighting with just numbers. And from the point of military art, these two things are incomparable. And drones are just a part of the arsenal. You know what drone is on a tactical level. For example, our group is concentrated behind a building. We got the drone up, and we see that, for example, as people say we would not see otherwise. Okay, let's imagine that the drone gives us information, intel, that the enemy is hiding behind a neighbor building. And now that's how they acquired situational intelligence. I hate this terminology, but it's NATO term, so okay. Situational awareness. And we understand that this is the side where the enemy is creeping up upon us. So what are we doing? We are to set an ambush and to destroy them, right? But there is a nuance. In order to go and get that enemy, your people need to A, know how to, and B, want to. And in military work, hard skills and soft skills are connected like nowhere else. You can be 3 times professional, but if you have no will to fight, you'll not be able to. So those who want to fight, those who are eager to fight for their values, these are the ones who actually succeed. And well-prepared infantry is the highest value on the battlefield. No drone, no HIMARS can be as effective as, at the end of the day, as the infantry who knows how to and who is eager to fight. All right, let me clarify one thing about Bakhmut. Azov, they kicked Russian troops out, one of the pincers around Bakhmut, or did they kick Wagner troops outside of Bakhmut? Western outskirts of Bakhmut. That's what I said. 3rd Storm Brigade is reporting that they did an offensive operation on the western outskirts of Bahmut, creating a Placdarm for the future offensive. I think Placdarm is a bit too strong of a term. It's an operative level. Brigade doesn't create Placdarms, but these are minor. The width of the breakthrough, which again, breakthrough probably not the right term for that, but the width of the operation was about 2 kilometers and depth was about 700 yards, 700 meters. But I guess we can excuse the small misuse of terminology because right now they're one of the leading storm forces of Ukraine, and terminology is something that can be acquired later. But yeah, so western outskirts. So it should be Wagner then, right? I don't know. They did not elaborate which ones, but they're saying 50 killed, 100 wounded of enemy troops, 4 taken prisoner. They also got a hold of some reserves and a couple of stockpiles of ammo and arms. So Bahmut, that's legally was captured, right? Yeah, legally it is captured, exactly. But the main core of this war is motivated infantry. The drones, the Death Stars, these are just another kind of weapons being used. But since the times of David, who is fighting the Goliath, even from the early on caveman days of humanity, it all comes down to a motivated human who is eager to fight for his interest. Everything else is just kinds of arms that he is using. There was a digging stick, a stone axe, and somewhere down that line would be a Death Star. But nothing changes at the core of it. There's got to be a human who is eager to go into fight and to fight for his interests. All right, so let's look at the motivated infantry then. And the simplest question I have when I'm looking at the preparations for this offensive by the Ukrainian side: do you think Russian troops will flee? Yeah, part of them will. Without a doubt. One needs to understand that our intel capabilities are higher than Russian, and we know where weaker and less motivated troops are. And that's, if you have to follow the science, that's where you gotta hit, where it's weak. Is Ukrainian military interested in Russian soldiers surrendering? Absolutely. We are, yes. Then the question is how to do that, because technically it's not so easy as I understand. I will even use this opportunity to tell the story about the 9th of May that got to me. It was rather well known, and then Osechkin published additional videos. That was the story when a telepilot of a drone of the 92nd Brigade of Ukraine military saved the life of Russian military, of Russian soldier, Ruslan Anisin. He, with 2 more soldiers, he was a mobilized infantryman, and he was threatened with execution for attempt to leave his positions, so he was taken out by Wagners to be executed or forced into battle. So drones attacked them, dropped a couple grenades on Wagners, and Wagner troops suicided themselves because they understood that nobody's going to come save them. And then the operator of a drone, it was probably the same person who just killed 2 Wagner troops, he sees that other soldier who is waving hands at the drone, showing that he's eager to surrender. And then the operator cancelled the attack, asked for a commander's decision to confirm that. Then they got another drone that delivered a note to Ruslan, which actually was Russian soldier thought it was a grenade, but it wasn't. It was a note. So the note told him, follow us if you want to live. And he followed the drone for 2 hours. It took him 2 hours to get out of where he was. And in these 2 hours, Russian side tried to shell him with mortar fire, with machine gun. There were over 10 attempts to kill him were undertaken unsuccessfully, and the drone operator led him to the Ukrainian side, and finally they recorded a video with Osechkin together. So that story is unscalable, I think, right? Drone operators will not be able to save life of every soldier and dedicate 2 hours of operator time and drone during the offensive. Yulia, the offensive will have a different character than people are expecting. And there will be a lot of opportunities to surrender that I think people will be using. But I have to highlight that on the Russian side, right before, on the eve of our offensive, they're talking in their Congress about criminalizing surrender. And they're basically trying to adopt a law that would equalize surrender with treason. But they're trying to motivate, essentially, and Russian troops will still surrender because given a chance to live or to die for unknown reasons, yeah, most of them would probably choose to live. And we've given these instructions many times, and any soldier who managed to survive for a week on the front, he knows how to surrender. You need to drop your rifle, get your hands up, probably have a white handkerchief or some cloth in your hand. But how do you surrender if there are 20 kilometers between you and the enemy? Oh, no, when the offensive happens, there won't be 20 kilometers, there'll be five yards. You just don't need to be a hero, really. Because if you don't want to surrender, then there'll be a tank approaching the building and probably leveling it before you get a second chance to do that. But if you're surrendering, our troops do not execute prisoners of war. We do not punish them. We save them and return them to exchange for our troops. We return them to their mothers. And since Russians have more troops and more citizens of Ukraine on their side captured since the beginning of this operation, because any offender usually has a better chance of capturing people, and they gathered both civilians and military. So we need their prisoners not only, because we like to take them captive. No, we also want to bring back our soldiers. And we do have a lot of proof that we treat prisoners nicely. And, the fact itself that you brought, when people risk the drone that costs money, actually 2 drones, and they managed to kill 2 Wagners, and they could have killed the third one, right? They could have just said it's another casualty of war, but they did dedicate 2 hours to get this person out. Could you imagine sitting 2 hours at the screens trying to get the person out? In war, everything is very lightningly fast. Very often decisions are made, why would they even bother for 2 hours, right? But here, the person definitely our operator had a will to save the life of that specific soldier. And today he is alive, he is giving interviews instead of rotting somewhere in the fields. It's a strong message. And I'll reiterate once again, when counteroffensive starts, it'll be much easier for Russian troops to surrender. Because when I was talking last time with Fagin, I did turn to Russian mothers, specifically, that we're only shooting at your soldiers. It is Putin who is killing them. You understand, right? And they have a wonderful opportunity to not let Putin kill them. This war, they do not need this war. Neither Russian mothers nor Russian soldiers, nobody attacked Russian territory. Russia is the country in this war, has no reasons to fight us. They came to our territory. We are defending our mothers, or defending our families, our land. And we don't have a desire to just execute them all, kill them all from the hip fire. We have a wish for them to lose and to get the F from our land. But the best way for us is to follow European rules of the war. We are a European army of a European nation, and we're following these guidelines. So for those who surrender, they stay intact, they are provided help, and they're exchanged later. So with motivation, this war is somewhat peculiarly different from many others. This one has a lot of private army activity. On our in front of us, that Wagner troop, basically a private army, is waging significant military effort. And what's interesting that all the military revolutions in Europe, everything that was related to leaving feudalism, was basically based on getting rid of the hired guns and graduating into European armies that we know today. Because all these hired guns, they were doing, of course, what they were doing best. They were making money for themselves with bloody and murderous actions. And here we have Russian Wallenstein, or however you want to call him, and he's basically running his own private army. So, on the front, do you think Ukraine military can use that private army in some capacity? And what are the real relations between Putin and Prigozhin? How do you think he even allowed for the private army to exist? Putin, who is destroying every initiative. No, Yulia, he's not destroying every initiative. He's defending initiatives that he's considering inappropriate. And when or if you have guessed the will of the Tsar, then you will get support. Actually, you're right. You're right. Exactly. If somebody is, writing on their neighbors that they have Ukrainian flags or something, Putin's regime likes it. So it's just those who guess his thoughts, they get funding and they get resources. Wagner is essentially private army that was created for work in gray zones where it is too costly for the country, for the government to politically operate and to take responsibility of their actions. Since very often they work on the border or behind the line of what is considered to be military crime. That is a specificity of Russian private army. In the West, there are some private forces too, but they are staying within the legal frame field, and they are actually getting paid probably 5 times more than the regular military sergeant. Because, and still, it is less expensive to use private military than regular army, because imagine using regular army, tanks and all the equipment. It costs a ton to deploy and to use. Private military, they're essentially a light infantry. They're light infantry that is cheap to use, and even if they are costing more than per unit, they still cost probably 50 times cheaper than the use of the regular military would be. And that's why they're getting higher salaries. And for good money, they usually get good specialists, and overall, they get a generally good story. But still, not without some scandals. Americans and other countries also had scandals around their private troops. But Wagner, by default, was initially formed for Africa and Syria. They had to solve a certain specific tasks near diamond mines to figure out relations and income from African countries. And they have a very specific personnel who's going there for money. And overall, that eventually creates a certain code that is capable to serve as a motivation system. And at the end, basically, Wagner starts to fight better than Russian army because they have more professionalism, more experience. Is it good for Putin? Yeah, I would say it is, because it's a Byzantium system where Tsar is the arbiter and big dukes are duking it out between each other. Military were supposed to solve the main historic issue, the main historic task that Putin posed, the capture of Ukraine. He thought he'll be a figure equal to Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. As Lavrov said, he named these figures, these historic figures, on purpose in his speech at the beginning of this war. So military are the most despised part of Russian elites. Everybody understands that you can bite them. Everybody knows there that you can bully them. I was trying to use a different word, not sure if that exists, but if you bully a military, Tsar may actually be pleased with you, because military are now the figures that are being used for punishment. They're very the whole Russian Putin system is very upset with them, given how much they invested into that part, how much money and resources they invested into Russian army, and how it overall failed as the result. And they're being tolerated only because the war still goes on and somebody needs to fight it. But they're being bullied. And you can see also that, by the way, Kadyrov did attack Prigozhin in his speeches, and he tried to play a system player role in this case, after which he's got serious issues with kidneys. And as some people are saying, that he is changing his politics. So Putin is balancing. He revived Lapin, who administratively was dead. That's kind of a administrative bureaucratic resurrection, not exactly like Jesus Christ, but very similar in Russian bureaucratic hierarchy in terms of improbability. But he did dust him off and bring him up again. So he's not letting them completely be trampled. He doesn't want the country where Prigozhins and Kadyrovs win. He is closer to the country that has a system, the military and special services system that is commendable and manageable. But overall, he doesn't like military. Like Shoigu and Gerasimov, they're not in favor. Well, Shoigu is not really a military guy, right? Well, he's a minister of defense by his position. That's why Wagner troops can shoot up their pictures, can curse them with last words, and nothing is happening to them. Because if there was no government will to do that, to allow them to do that, then those people who shot up the pictures of the head of the general command of the military would have woken up next day and their head would be on a shelf somewhere near the bed. But since it's not happening, that means that it is allowed. And if it is allowed, they're using it. And Prigozhin is solving two tasks. When he's screaming hysterically in his videos, 25 or 27-minute videos, he's getting rid of responsibility because his losses are through the roof. And as he's saying, the Council of Commanders of Wagner is giving him a right to speak for them. But the same council can also ask a question, why are they wasting so many people? Because more and more they're actually wasting their real core instead of the prisoners, inmates, and others. Yeah, they planned to fight a different war. Now they have to actually waste their own core personnel. The people who came there to earn money, now they're losing them. And regardless, even with all these statements, they're still failing to take all the goals, achieve all the goals they stated. So he's using some hype to change his political status, to maybe move from the fifth to the fourth or the third level of Russian bureaucracy. And that's an old story. The Tsar is looking at the arena and all these dukes are duking it out in there. And the winner gets a horse or gets thanks or gets money. And they're fighting in front of him. And he's just observing that. Whom to elevate, whom to bring down. But even the winners, their position is very temporary. Remember Wagner's statement that they will fight till the 10th of May and then leave? Yeah, they were not allowed to. They stayed. They had to stay. So that's the system, in brief. Coming back, and I want to clarify one short thing. In 2014, you said that Ukrainian troops let Girkin and his column leave Donbas because in his memories he was saying that they were actually dispersed and were leaving the area through the woods. Now, Yulia, this is a sad story actually, and I didn't bring it up for nothing. It's a sad story where a lot of respectable people failed to provide adequate explanation to what happened. Even though they still have some my respect to this day. I partook in some of those events. Let's not go into details of it, but let's deep dive. Okay, let's hint. This story is still alive. People who were for or were actually supportive of Ukrainian side and who were in that column, they were not even putting bullets in their guns. They were saying, we knew nothing is going to happen to us as we march out. So the second question, Girkin had to leave Slavyansk back in the day. Do I understand it right? that Besler, who was on the flank, who left, and Besler left because Ukraine struck a deal with him. So Girkin had to leave. That I don't know, but I remember that when Girkin entered Donetsk, Donetsk completely fell. Until that moment, Donetsk was only partly occupied by Russian separatists and special services and Wagner and others, and they were military detachments that were still fighting. And only people who fled from left Slavyansk and entered Donetsk allowed them to capture Donetsk fully. And at that time, Donetsk was still Ukrainian to a large degree. Many parts of city were still resisting, and upon the completion of this operation, the separatists actually got a lot of ammo, a lot of weapons. So actually a double complex for the troops that were stationed in the city. So there's a lot of interesting things that are still to be dug up there later. So I also heard that Besler, that other field commander, was about to go to Ukrainian side. Well, I doubt it. He was a Russian military intel. As an officer of that level, he could negotiate that. But leaving Russia for Ukraine at that moment, when Ukraine was not supported by the West, when the West abandoned us, and Ukraine was really nothing at that time, had nothing to offer him to change sides. So I doubt he even seriously considered that. So let me bring back also another story, the Crimea 2014, when it was annexed. Why Ukraine did not resist? That's another good story, Yulia. And it is still missing an interesting seed, an interesting core that would click and give people a light bulb, going up above the head, like, oh, that's how it happened. So first of all, I would say one of the factors is that Crimean troops were mostly based out of Crimean people who were not in the mood of fighting Russians, like really fighting and shooting at them. Second, administrative part of Ukraine just fled, didn't provide any strength or support to military. This is a sad story, and despite all of our successes and other things on this front, this story has not been washed yet. It will be washed only after we retake Crimea. And I quarreled with a lot of military friends at that time who were stationed in Crimea, who were telling me, we would look at you if you were there. But you understand. And where did they go? These military friends of yours? Oh, yeah, they're here in Ukraine. They're fighting now. But in my opinion, a military guy who is not shooting at the enemy that is capturing his own barracks, you can find different reasons for that, but there is no real excuse for allowing your enemy to do it. You don't need an order. You don't need an order to defend your territory. And this is my issue with them. Because when your foes enter your territory or steal your equipment, you have to shoot as a military person. I have a hypothesis why the order wasn't given. Why? I'm comparing that with 2008. And in 2008, there was a story in Georgia when Saakashvili was screaming, see, Russian troops are going through the rock tunnel. They are going to the positions. They are getting ready to to start the conflict. And nobody was answering, nobody was reacting to that. Before that, the last Western visitor was Condoleezza Rice, who said, please do not make the situation more difficult than you have to. He couldn't reach anybody on the West. The only person who picked the phone was Matthew Breza, I think, and he was somewhere in the national security, who basically was telling him, don't escalate, de-escalate, please. And Saakashvili at that point had no exit, really. The only way he could do was to hit Russians that were invading his country. And after that, the West actually brought up this strike and blamed it on Saakashvili, saying that you have done something prematurely. If you have not hit Russia, if you fled Tbilisi, everything legally would be correct. Russian would be in the wrong. We could still bring this as a legal case, that this is a wrong occupation. And looking at the behavior of the West, that was basically saying at that time, we just want our hands to be clean and we want it to be legally certain in a certain light. And at that time, Steinmeier and Tellerini were trying to even put Saakashvili into the court system for escalating the conflict. And I'm suspecting that people in Crimea and Ukraine, the administration, also were posed in the same light, that they had to make a decision, and they were looking at what happened in Georgia before. They were very heavy about or hesitant about making that decision. Yes, and still they had to make the decision. And I think history and Ukrainian people will evaluate in the same light. I don't know if you noticed it. It was in the news, but it wasn't really, it didn't get much light. In 2020 or 21, maybe a little earlier than that, 14 Ukrainian generals signed a collective letter about the necessity to investigate the occupation of Crimea to a more detail. 14 generals, very serious people, the highest level of commanding officers in Ukraine, both the active ones and the ones in retirement. And they were hinting at certain facts, to put it diplomatically. So in military circles, there are still rumors circulating that on the main command outpost, the moment when Russian troops were being deployed into Crimea in February, and when those big airplanes with paratroopers were flying in, the generals suggested to shoot down these planes. And now imagine a situation when Ukraine would open fire on these paratroopers, and one of the systems shoots down a big cargo jet with 150 Russian paratroopers, and they all die. What would be the perspective of capturing Crimea? Zero, exactly, because then they would not be able to drop additional detachments in there, and the troops they had in Crimea did not have enough. Because then, right, the troops in Crimea would also be supported, and they would see that their generals actually have cojones, right? Exactly. We numerically exceeded Russian troops who were in Crimea at that time. So given some support, we would kick them out. We would finish them there. And that scary possible motion of going through Donbas and going down south to the mouth of, to the top of Crimean Peninsula, that was not a real threat. Even in the 2014, when they did the push, they failed to get as far as Crimea by ground. Even Ilovai's group, by Russian estimates, the most successful one, only got 50% of the tasks achieved. And they basically were repelled by Ukrainian army, who was at the lowest at this point. And the army that looked more like Makhno gang at this period of time, versus right now we look more like Starship Troopers compared to what we were in 2014. So that's my point. When the enemy is invading, you have to shoot. And that's it. And there would not be occupation of Crimea. That was the biggest surprise for me in all that story. But you did make a good point, that army in this case, just like on Damansk Island, Soviet lieutenant who didn't ask Chinese and just shot at them and essentially stopped that attempt to capture. I thought you needed an order, right? No, you don't need an order. If you are on duty and you see invaders, you have to use your arms against them. Any military detachment, any barracks, any area, any camp is being protected by officers and people on duty. So he needs to open fire on the invaders, and if he's being attacked in return, then the whole detachment has to take arms and go into fight, which also is backed by certain plans and certain training exercises. Just one brigade in Perevalny was, that story was interesting. It was one of the most battle-worthy detachments at that time, and it surrendered. And I think the commander of the brigade who jumped to the Russian side just surrendered the whole brigade. Very sad story. But at the same time, the intel company of the 25th Brigade left Crimea with their flags and full in the open on their equipment and their vehicles. And Russians were afraid to touch them, because these guys told them, we'll shoot if you'd even try. I know that Russian troops were very afraid while doing that operation. They thought that they did not have much of a chance, and they were surprised that we did not resist. So this is one of the biggest blunders, and to wash off the that blunder, I think the only thing we can do is really retake Crimea back. And it's not only about Russian sides who behave in a certain way and they didn't have much experience and all. It's about us, decisions that we made. And yeah, one can say that we are a young nation who has never fought a real big war before that, who has never faced such a strategic operation against ourselves before, when at the time of invasion, three top officers of special forces, military, and police are all Russian citizens. We didn't know what to do as a group, as overall a country. Some of us knew, but they were not listened to. And crisis, as you know, is not when you don't have people who can make a right decision, but when those people who can make that decision cannot be in the place where they can make that decision effectively. So, out of all you were saying, I was always surprised how in Munich in 23, Hitler's putsch was very close to success. Very few people know, but it was decided in a few seconds, and it looked like that crowd, that big crowd of people with Hitler and Hindenburg were moving across the bridges in the center of town, and police in many cases just let them pass. They walked away, or some even joined them. And finally, this crowd got to the central square, where there was a small detachment of, I don't remember, soldiers or police, and Hitler and Hindenburg were turned to them saying, well, what are you standing here? Move away. Give us way. And lieutenant who was in charge, he gave an order to shoot. And soldiers started shooting, and in just a few seconds, the whole crowd was dispersed. And if he wouldn't say fire, I am thinking that November putsch of Hitler would be successful. In the Germany of those times, power was laying on the ground, and whoever had enough intent to pick it up could win. And Hitler would have plus 10 more years, and the world history might have taken a different turn, right? Well, true, we wouldn't have, that events would be unfold differently. Because he could have been assassinated next year, right? Could have been, but then that would have saved 120 million people, right? Let's finish on a different note. The blame that not a single military or not a single administrator gave an order to shoot back at the Russian invaders is compensated by what we are doing now. Because given the fact that our troops now, the way they fight this war, the way we learned how to resist, the way we learned how to achieve our goals, even our biggest allies are surprised at the effectiveness of our troops these days. And I think Putin played a role in teaching your troops. If you're bold enough, you can eat it, right? Yeah, our guys are now doing things that you only see in Hollywood movies. Even rangers from the experienced detachments are saying, what the heck are you doing, guys? And we were doing, and we will be doing that. And the pendulum is just swinging in a different direction, and it's in the right place right now. Even looking at the Crimea back then, it was a very atypical behavior for us. It was probably a sum of shocks and surprises combined together, and it is not due to scary Russian propaganda or mighty Russian troops, but just a shock. We failed to adequately respond and adequately manage ourselves. And the moment we figured out how to manage ourselves, our caustic energy is back. And there'll be more stuff coming. And I have a last question, very important. We just need to close the topic of Crimea. You said that Ukrainian generals saw the transport ills that were transporting Russian troops. Helicopters, Mi-8s, cargo ills, and if these jets and planes were seen not only by Ukrainian soldiers and officers, but also by Americans, right? And Americans at that time were saying that there is nothing happening, nothing is going on. And my question is, what did CIA think about? How did they completely miss it? There is a legend. There is a legend that looks like truth, actually. 2 months before Soviet Union fell apart, there was a big 5-year report of Sovietologists and other Russophobes in the American Intel Society about the perspective of USSR. And these kind people actually made a statement that USSR will exist at least to 2030, and nothing is threatening its existence. And they were asking for more money to fight with them. Exactly. And 2 months after that statement, after that report, Soviet Union fell apart. I would say that Vladimir Lenin, probably an infernal character, but he did understand a few things, I think, even though the dark figure as he is. In February of, I think, maybe January of 1918, he told to the young revolutionaries, he is basically saying that revolution is a difficult thing. We won't see it. You probably will see that. But even he was erred, because just a month later there was February Revolution in Russia, in Tsar Russia. Right, but that's a trend guessing that he is failing in. But CIA at that time actually saw the planes. They saw them on the radar. Why did they not react? Well, Yulia, many people see not necessarily what is happening, but what they want to see. And they try to match facts to their picture of the world. And a lot of people are using that to just support themselves. It's confirmation bias. Very few people try to use these facts to try to test the strength of their theory, of their view. It's the story of my life. I keep seeing people around who see what they want to see, and I see what there is. And very often there is a big disconnect. And back then I was just captain. Alexey, on this great note, I'm sorry we spilled over a few minutes over an hour, but we talked about important things, I think. We wanted to finish it. That was Yulia Latynina and Alexey Arestovych. Alexey, thank you very much. Thank you. Till later.